Written by a Roman emperor, Meditations is not a book meant to be read, it is a book meant to be lived. Book 1. The example of my grandfather, Verus, gave me a good disposition, not prone to anger. By the recollection of my father's character, I learned to be both modest and manly. As for my mother, she taught me to have regard for religion, to be generous and open-handed, and not only to forbear from doing anybody an ill turn, but not so much as to endure the thought of it. By her, likewise, I was bred to a plain, inexpensive way of living, very different from the common luxury of the rich. I have to thank my great-grandfather that I did not go to a public school, but had good masters at home and learned to know that one ought to spend liberally on such things. From my governor, I learned not to join either the green or the blue faction on the race ground, nor to support the Parmularius or Scutarius at the gladiators' shows. He taught me also to put my own hand to business upon occasion, to endure hardship and fatigues, and to throw the necessities of nature into a little compass, that I ought not to meddle with other people's business, nor be easy in giving credit to informers, from Diognetus to shun vain pursuits, not to be led away with the impostures of wizards and soothsayers who prevent they can discharge evil spirits and do strange feats by the strength of a charm, not to keep quails for the pit, nor to be eager after any such thing. This Diognetus taught me to bear freedom and plain dealing in others, and apply myself to philosophy. He also procured me the instruction of Vacius, Tandasis, and Marcianus. He likewise put me upon improving myself by writing dialogues when I was a boy, prevailed with me to prefer a couch covered with hides to a bed of state, and reconciled me to other like rigors of the Grecian discipline. It was Rusticus that first made me desire to live rightly and come to a better state, who prevented me from running into the vanity of the sophists, either by writing speculative treatises, haranguing upon moral subjects, or making a fantastical appearance or display of generosity or discipline. This philosopher kept me from yielding to the charms of rhetoric and poetry, from affecting the character of a man of pleasantry, from wearing my senator's robe in the house, or anything of this kind which looks like conceit and affectation. He taught me to write letters in a plain ornamental style, like that dated by him from Sinuessa to my mother. By his instructions, I was persuaded to be easily reconciled to those who have misbehaved themselves and disobliged me, as soon as they desired reconciliation. And of the same master I learned to read an authors carefully, not to take up with a superficial view or assent quickly to idle talkers. And to conclude with him, he gave me his own copy of Epictetus' Memoirs. Apollonius taught me to give my mind its due freedom and disengage it from dependence upon chance, and not to regard, though ever so little, anything uncountenanced by reason, to maintain an equality of temper, even in acute pains and loss of children or tedious sickness. His practice was an excellent instance that a man be forcible and yet unbend his humor as occasion requires. The heaviness and impertinence of his scholars could seldom rouse his ill temper. As for this, his learning and the peculiar happiness of his manner in teaching, he was so far from being proud of himself upon this score that one might easily perceive he thought it one of the least things which belonged to him. This great man led me into the true secret of receiving an obligation without either listening myself or seeming ungrateful to my friends. The philosopher Sextus recommended good humor to me and showed me the pattern of a household governed in a fatherly manner. He also bade me make nature and reason my rule to live by. By his precedent I was instructed to appear with an unaffected gravity, to study the temper and circumstances of my friends in order to oblige them. I saw him bearing with the ignorant and undiscerning, complacent and obliging to all people, so that his conversation was more charming than flattery, and yet at the same time he was held in the highest reverence by others. Conversing with this philosopher helped me to draw up a true, intelligible, and methodical scheme for life and manners, and never so much as to show the least sign of anger or any other disturbing thought, but to be perfectly calm and indifferent, yet tender-hearted. However, he let me see in himself that a man might show his goodwill significantly enough, without noise and displays, and likewise possess great knowledge without vanity and ostentation. Alexander the grammarian taught me not to be ruggedly critical about words, nor find fault with people for improprieties of phrase or pronunciation, but to set them right by speaking that thing properly myself, and that either by way of answer, assent, or inquiry, or by some such other indirect and suitable correction. Fronto taught me that envy, tricking, and dissimulation are the character and consequences of tyranny, and that those we call patricians have commonly not much fatherly feeling in them. Alexander the Platonist advised me that without necessity I should never say to anyone, nor write, in a letter that I am not at leisure, nor make business an excuse to decline frequently the offices of humanity to those we dwell with. I learned of Catullus not to slight a friend for making a remonstrance, though it should happen to be unreasonable, but rather to endeavor to restore him to his natural humor, that, like Domitius and Athenodotus, I should always speak well of those who have the care of my education, and that I should always preserve an hearty affection for my children. I am indebted to Severus for the love I bear to my relations, and towards justice and truth. He likewise made me acquainted with the character and sentiments of Cato, Brutus, Thrasea, Helvidius, and Dio, and gave me the idea of an equal commonwealth, with equal rights and equal speech, and also of a monarchy, where the liberty of the subject was principally regarded. To mention some more of my obligations to him, it was of him I learned not to grow wise by starts and sudden fancies, but to be a constant admirer of philosophy and improvement, that a man ought to be generous and obliging, hope the best of matters, and never question the affection of his friends, to be free in showing a reasonable dislike of another, and no less clear in his own expectations and desires, and not to put his friends to the trouble of divining what he would be at. I learned from Maximus to command myself and not to be too much drawn towards anything, to be full of spirits under sickness and misfortune, to appear with modesty, obliqueness, and dignity of behavior, to turn off business smoothly as it arises, without drudging and complaint. Whatever he did, all men believed him, that as he spoke, so he thought, and whatever he did, that he did with a good intent. He attained that greatness of mind, not to wonder or start at anything, neither to hurry an enterprise, nor sleep over it, never to be puzzled or dejected, nor to put on an appearance of friendliness, not to be angry or suspicious, but ever ready to do good and to forgive and speak truth, and all this as one who seemed rather of himself to be straight and right than ever to have been rectified. Nobody ever could fancy they were slighted by him or dared to think themselves his betters. Besides all this, he had an agreeable wit. In my adoptive father, I observed a smooth and inoffensive temper, with great steadiness in keeping close to measures judiciously taken, a greatness proof against vanity and the impressions of pomp and power. From him, a prince might learn to love business and action and be constantly at it, to be willing to hear out any proposal relating to public advantage, and undeviatingly give every man his due, to understand the critical seasons and circumstances for rigor or remissness, to have no boy favorites, not to stand upon points of state and prerogative, but to leave his nobility at perfect liberty in their visits and attendance, and when he was upon his progress, no man lost his favour for not being at leisure to follow the cart, to debate matters nicely and thoroughly at the council board, and then to stand by what was resolved on, yet not hastily to give up the inquiry, as one easily satisfied with sullen notions and apprehensions, to be constant to a friend without tiring or fondness, to be always satisfied and cheerful, to reach forward into the future and manage accordingly, not to neglect the least concerns, but all without hurry or being embarrassed. Further, by observing his methods and administration, I had the opportunity of learning how much it was the part of a prince to check the excesses of panegyric and flattery, to have his magazines and exchequer well furnished, to be frugal in his expenses without minding being lampooned for his pains, not to worship the gods to superstition, not to court the populace either by prodigality or compliment, but rather to be sober and firm upon all occasions, keeping things in a steady decorum, without chopping and changing of measures, to enjoy the plenty and magnificence of a sovereign fortune without bragging, and yet without making excuse, so as freely to enjoy them when present, but when wanting, not to be mortified at the loss of them, and to behave himself so that no man could charge him with sophistry or buffooning or being a pedant. No, he was a person mature and perfect, scorning flattery, and throughoutly qualified to govern himself and others. As for those that were philosophers in earnest, he had a great regard for them, but without reproaching those who were otherwise, nor yet being led away by this. He was condescending and familiar in conversation, and pleasant too, but not to tiresomeness and excess. As for his health, he was not anxious about it, like one fond of living, or over studious of bodily appearance, and yet managed his constitution with that care as seldom to stand in need of the assistance of physic or outward applications. Further, he never envied and browbeat those that were eminent in any faculty or science, as eloquence or knowledge of the laws or morals, but, on the contrary, encouraged them in their ways and promoted their reputation. He observed fitness and custom in all his actions, and yet did not seem to regard them. He was not fickle and fluttering in his humor, but constant both to place and undertaking. And I have seen him, after violent fits of the headache, return fresh and vigorous to his usual business. He kept by but few things to himself, and those were secrets of government. He was very moderate and frugal in shows, public buildings, liberalities, and such like, being one that did not so much regard the popularity as the rightness of an action. It was none of his custom to wait an unusual hours, or to be overcome with the fancy of building, to study eating and luxury, to value the curiosity of his clothes, or the shape and person of his servants. His cloak came from Lorium, his villa on the coast at Lanuvium. He wore for the most part only a tunic, and at Tusculum he would scarcely so much as put on a cloak without making an excuse for it. To take him altogether, there was nothing of rudeness in modesty or eagerness in his temper. Neither did he ever seem to drudge and sweat at the helm. Things were dispatched at leisure and without being felt, and yet the administration was carried on without confusion, with great order, force, and uniformity. Upon the whole, what was told of Socrates is applicable to him, for he was so much master of himself that he could either take or leave those conveniences of life with respect to which most people are either uneasy without them or intemperate with them. Now, to hold on with fortitude in one condition and sobriety in the other is a proof of a great soul and an impregnable virtue, such as he showed in the sickness of Maximus. I have to thank the gods that my grandfather's parents, sister, preceptors, relations, friends, and domestics were almost all of them persons of probity, and that I never happened to disoblige or misbehave myself towards any of them, notwithstanding that my disposition was such that, had occasion offered, I might have acted thus. But by the godness of the gods, I met with no provocations to reveal my infirmities. It is likewise by their providence that my childhood was no longer managed by my grandfather's mistress, that I preserved the flower of my youth, that I was subject to the emperor my father, and breathed under him, who was the most proper person living to put me out of conceit with pride, and to convince me that it is possible to live in a palace without the ceremony of guards, without richness and distinction of habit, without torches, statues, or such other marks of royalty and state, and that a prince may shrink himself almost into the figure of a private gentleman, and yet act, nevertheless, with all the force and majesty of his character when the commonwealth requires it. It is the favor of the gods that I happened to meet with a brother whose behavior and affection is such as to contribute both to my pleasure and improvement. It is also their blessing that my children were neither stupid nor misshapen, that I made no further advances in rhetoric, poetry, and such other amusements, which possibly might have engaged my fancy too far, had I found myself a considerable proficient, that, without asking, I gave my governors that share of honor which they seemed to desire, and did not put them off from time to time with promises and excuses, because they were yet but young, that I had the happiness of being acquainted with Apollonius, Rusticus, and Maximus, that I have a clear idea of the life in accordance with nature, and the impression frequently refreshed, so that, considering the extraordinary assistance and directions of the gods, it is impossible for me to miss the road of nature unless by refusing to be guided by the dictates and almost sensible inspirations of heaven. It is by their favor that my constitution has held out so well under a life of fatigue and business, that I never had to do with Benedicta or Theodotus, and when I fell into some fits of love, I was soon cured. That when I fell out with Rusticus, as it frequently happened, I was not transported into any act of violence, that I had the satisfaction of my mother's life and company and a considerable while, though she was destined to die young, that when I was willing to relieve the necessities of others, I was never told that the exchequer was empty, and again, it is they that kept me from standing in need of any man's fortune. Further, it is from them that my wife is so very obedient and affectionate, and so remote from luxury, that I had choice of good governors for my children, that remedies were prescribed me in a dream against giddiness and spitting of blood, as at Gajeta, by an ointment, that when I had a mind to look into philosophy, I did not meet with a sophist to instruct me, that I did not spend too much time in reading history, chopping logic, or considering the heavens. Now, all these points could never have been compassed without a protection from above and the gods presiding over fate. This was written in the country of the Quadi, at the Grano.